The most dangerous losses in finance are not the ones that scream at you from a red screen. They are the ones that sit quietly, report smooth numbers, pay a handsome coupon, and then, on the exact day you need your money, teach you that what looked like a door was only paint on a wall. I have spent my life around capital, and I will tell you something most people learn too late. If you cannot explain where the exit is, who controls it, and what happens when everyone wants out at the same time, you do not own safety. You own a story. That distinction is about to matter more than most people understand. A lot of investors right now are looking in the wrong direction. They are looking at war headlines, oil headlines, election headlines, inflation headlines, and all the other things that make television producers rich. But the real danger is often the things sophisticated people hope will stay boring long enough to keep the machine alive. That machine is private credit. You have probably already heard the flattering version. It sounds elegant, it sounds elite, it sounds like access. Banks pulled back after 2008. A vacuum opened, private lenders stepped in, middle market businesses got funding. Investors got extra yield for giving up liquidity. Everybody won. A cleaner system, a smarter system, a more stable system. That is the polished brochure version. I am interested in the door, not the brochure. And the first thing I want you to see is brutally simple. Private credit did not become popular because risk disappeared. It became popular because risk stopped trading in public. That is a very different thing. When a risk trades in public, the market embarrasses you in real time. Prices move, spreads widen, discounts show up, and nobody gets to pretend a weak loan is a strong loan for very long. But when a risk sits in a private vehicle with no daily scoreboard and no easy comparison point, the temptation becomes overwhelming. People stop asking what it is worth. They start asking what story can keep the door calm for one more quarter. That is how smoothness becomes a drug. I call this the smoothness premium. Ordinary investors will forgive almost any complexity if you wrap it in a stable line and a higher yield. They see a public market fund swinging around every day and they call it dangerous. They see an opaque private vehicle reporting almost nothing but calm and they call it sophisticated. Same economy, same borrowers, same pressure, different mirror. The human mind is weak in exactly that way. You do not fear what you cannot see. You fear what is marked in front of you. So the instrument that reports pain looks risky, and the instrument that withholds pain looks safe. That is not rationality, that is self-hypnosis with a statement attached. Private credit was born in the long shadow of 2008, and on the surface that origin makes sense. Banks were forced to carry more capital against risky loans. They retreated from parts of the market that suddenly looked expensive to serve. Private capital stepped in and started lending directly to middle market companies, many of them controlled by private equity sponsors, many of them levered, many of them more fragile than the cheerful yield story led on. The selling point was simple. I will lock up your money and pay you more. You give up instant liquidity. I give you an illiquidity premium. That sounds fine until you ask the only question that matters. Premium over what? Over transparency, over control, over your ability to leave, over your ability to know whether the thing is worth 100 cents on the dollar or 60, over your ability to tell whether interest is being paid in cash or simply stapled onto a loan, so the patient can look alive for another quarter. Yield by itself means nothing. I have never been impressed by return without context. A return number without a door structure is decoration. For years, the industry benefited from a beautiful coincidence. Institutional investors such as pension funds and sovereign pools of capital could not run on a whim. Their money was locked up for years. On the liability side, the door was sealed. On the asset side, the loans were long dated. That maturity match looked intelligent. It looked stable. If nobody can leave, the manager does not need to dump assets at the worst possible time. He can work through a problem. He can restructure a borrower. He can wait. That model had one virtue. It was honest about the door. Then greed did what greed always does. It reached for a bigger audience. Once the giant institutions began slowing their inflows, the sales machine did not decide to become more conservative. It decided to become more creative. That is when the door story changed. Suddenly, an asset class built on the premise of illiquidity began looking for ways to appear liquid enough for retail money, retirement money, and any other money that still believed elite access was the same thing as elite judgment. This is where people start getting hurt. If you sell an illiquid thing to a person who needs liquidity, you have created a timing bomb even before the credit goes bad. You have mismatched not just assets and liabilities, but psychology. The buyer believes there is a door. The structure only works if few people try to use it. Those are not the same statement. That difference is the entire ballgame. I call it the exit illusion. A financial product does not need to guarantee daily redemption to create the illusion. It only needs to suggest enough flexibility that the buyer imagines freedom. Quarterly windows, semi-liquid language, redemption feature. Access on request. Those phrases are not descriptions. They are sedatives. A door that works only when almost nobody opens it is not a door. It is crowd control. And once you understand that, the rest of the picture becomes much darker. The people pushing many of these products are not always being paid like fiduciaries guarding your future. They are often being paid like salesmen moving inventory. If a plain ETF pays almost nothing to distribute, and an opaque private credit wrapper pays rich upfront commissions and ongoing service fees, you do not need a psychology degree to know what happens next. The product is not bought, it is sold, not because the average investor woke up desperate for a slice of a levered middle market software loan, because somebody on the other side of the desk woke up desperate to collect economics. That is not democratization. That is distribution pressure wearing a tuxedo. Whenever you see that combination, high complexity, smooth reported returns, and rich sales incentives, you need to become extremely cold. Blooded, do not ask whether the pitch sounds professional. Ask who gets paid immediately, who gets paid later, and who gets trapped. If the door jams, you already know the answer. The manager gets fees, the advisor gets commission, the structure gets time, you get a promise. I have seen this movie enough times to know the script. Even when the actors change, the next layer is even more dangerous because it attacks the part of your brain that wants to believe bad news is isolated. One bankruptcy here, one fraud there, one borrower with double-pledged collateral, one balance sheet built on receivables, borrowed against multiple times. One founder whose wristwatch looks richer than his house, one refinancing merry-go-round where new debt quietly pays old debt so defaults stay cosmetically low, one ugly story, then another, then another. People like to call those exceptions. I call them door noises. If I walk through a building and hear one hinge crack, I pay attention. If I hear another 2 floors later, I stop admiring the wallpaper and start thinking about the frame. Finance is no different. A single failure can be bad luck. A cluster of failures is information, especially when the information shows you the same pattern again and again. Weak underwriting, performance theater, hidden leverage, overconfidence, and a quiet willingness to stretch definitions so reported stability can survive another reporting period. What bothers me is not only that losses exist. Losses are normal in credit. What bothers me is the mismatch between the advertised bruise count and the actual body count. If you tell me loss rates are microscopic in a world where speculative grade public debt is defaulting at a much higher rate, I do not assume you have discovered a law of nature. Nobody else understands. I assume you are using a different language for pain. That is one of the oldest tricks in finance. Rename the injury. Delay the recognition. Move the problem to a quiet room. Call it a restructuring, a workout, a handover, an amendment, a payment in kind, a liability management exercise, a maturity extension, a sponsor support event. Anything except what it feels like to the owner of capital. That language matters because it changes behavior. The average person hears public bankruptcy and thinks danger. He hears quiet handover and thinks manageable. But capital does not care what adjective you attach to a corpse. This is the hidden mechanism inside the private credit story. The market does not need a high headline bankruptcy count to be weak. It only needs enough private bruises hidden behind private reporting to make the published smoothness a lie. And lies in finance rarely stay still. They travel. They travel first through valuation. A public security is humiliated every day. That is one of the great virtues of markets. They do not care about your dignity. They print a price anyway. A private portfolio has more room to negotiate with reality. Managers can mark positions with models, assumptions, comparables, and patience. In moderation, that is sensible. In excess, it becomes what I call mark-to-magic. Mark-to-magic is not just accounting softness. It is a behavioral shield. It tells investors that volatility has gone away. It tells advisors that the product is holding up. It tells allocators that this sleeve of the portfolio is resilient. It tells retirement committees that maybe they should add more. And the entire time, what may have happened is not that risk disappeared, but that the scoreboard was unplugged. I do not like businesses that need darkness to look stable. If one market says the same risk is worth 60 and another says it is worth 100, somebody is not seeing clearly. Maybe public markets are panicking. That happens. Maybe private markets are too generous. That also happens. But when the gap gets wide enough, you are no longer debating small valuation philosophy. You are debating whether the room has been lit properly at all. Now add another human weakness. Once a manager knows investors love smoothness, he has every incentive to preserve it. Bad loans can be nursed, interest can be capitalized, classifications can be stretched. A software borrower can become a logistics borrower if that helps concentration metrics look more civilized. Exposure can be relabeled, weakness can be deferred. The investor is not being shown the asset, he is being shown the costume. That is what happens when the market starts valuing appearance more than exit honesty. The story gets more dangerous when you wrap this in a retail-friendly package. Publicly traded vehicles at least give you a market vote every day, even if that vote is ugly. If shares trade at a deep discount to stated book value, that is a signal, painful but useful. It says the market does not trust the marks. It says liquidity has value. It says a public quote is humiliating the fiction, but non-traded wrappers are a different beast. Here, you get the full sales pitch of sophistication, plus the comforting suggestion that some liquidity exists, just enough to keep you relaxed, never enough to make the structure truly honest. Redemption windows are offered, then caps appear. Not your cap, the fund S cap, which means your personal desire to leave does not determine whether you can leave. The crowd does. That is the moment most investors discover they do not own a door. They own a place in line. And lines change behavior in ugly ways. Once investors understand that only a limited amount of cash can come out each quarter, every rational person has an incentive to ask for as much as possible as early as possible. Not because each investor has suddenly become hysterical, but because the structure has made hesitation expensive. If you wait politely, you risk becoming the fool left behind, so the queue lengthens. The manager sells what can be sold. Usually that means the clean assets go first. The liquid assets go first. The better assets go first. What stays behind are things you did not want to own in the first place. The credits that need imagination, the borrowers living on extensions, the hidden bruises, the cockroaches. That is why I say the door is the asset. Most people still think the asset is the loan. Number in stress, the door becomes the asset. Who controls withdrawals? What gets sold first? Who is left holding the residue? Whether you can turn a statement balance into actual cash when fear arrives. Those are not side issues. Those are the investment. If you get that wrong, the coupon was bait. Now, let me push this deeper because many people make a second mistake. They hear all of this and imagine I am predicting an exact replay of 2008. I am not. The reason that matters is that many investors have a childish model of crisis. They think if a setup is dangerous, it must end in one sudden Hollywood explosion, or else the warnings were exaggerated. That is nonsense. Some systems blow up, some systems rot, both can destroy wealth. One does it fast, the other does it politely. Private credit, at least in the form described by the document in front of me, does not need to reproduce the precise mechanics of the global financial crisis to inflict real damage. Banks are better capitalized than they were. Then depositor runs are not the obvious center of gravity this time. But not the same as 2008 is a very low bar. You do not need your checking account to vanish for a bad structure, to poison retirements, distort valuations, damage insurers, and throttle credit to businesses that employ millions of people. That is the slow motion version, and slow motion is more dangerous for one reason. People keep adapting to it. They say this quarter is manageable. They say marks will catch up later. They say redemptions are orderly. They say the gate is temporary. They say the loans are money good over time. They say defaults are isolated. They say the public market is too pessimistic. They say the insurance wrapper is rated. They say the capital charge is lower because the risk is transformed. They say there is no fire because the smoke has not reached the lobby yet. That is how adults talk themselves into staying in a locked room. The insurance angle is especially revealing because it shows you how modern finance tries to solve one problem by inventing a prettier label for it. If a direct stake in risky private credit carries an equity-like capital charge, some engineer somewhere immediately asks how to make the same economic exposure look like something safer to the rulebook. A special vehicle appears, a note is issued, a rating is stamped on it, capital requirements fall. Nothing about the underlying borrower becomes less fragile. Visibility merely becomes more abstract. I have no admiration for that sort of cleverness. A rated black box is still a box. A sealed door with a nicer sign is still sealed. A yield pickup funded by reduced visibility is not innovation. It is camouflage. And camouflage works best on people who desperately want permission to stop thinking. That is why these products spread most aggressively when the world feels frustrating. Cash yields too little. Index funds feel boring. Public markets feel volatile. Inflation makes patience feel expensive. Then along comes a product offering high single digits or low double digits, low visible volatility. Institutional vocabulary and the seduction of exclusivity. The investor feels upgraded. He feels like he has moved from the waiting room into the boardroom. Most of the time, he has just moved from a transparent room into a darker one. This is the psychological damage at the center of the story. Private credit is not only selling yield, it is selling self-image. It lets ordinary people feel like insiders. It lets advisors feel like curators of sophistication. It lets managers feel like volatility tamers. It lets institutions feel modern. It lets everyone avoid the discomfort of admitting that plain public assets with honest marks may still be the more rational home for much of their capital. The enemy in finance is rarely complexity alone. The enemy is complexity plus vanity. Vanity is what keeps the door closed, because once a person has been sold on his own sophistication, he resists evidence that the structure is weaker than advertised. He does not want to look foolish. He does not want to explain to his spouse, his committee, his client, or himself that the thing he chose precisely because it looks superior may simply have been a smoother way to hold risk. That is why these stories drag on, not because the math is impossible, because the ego is, now let us talk about the real economic danger. I do not care, only because some wealthy investor might suffer a markdown. Wealthy investors can survive pain. Markets are supposed to punish bad judgment. That part does not bother me. What bothers me is the point where a fragile funding structure becomes important enough to the real economy that its self-protection changes behavior on Main Street. If private credit has become a major lender to middle market businesses, then a wave of redemption pressure does not remain inside a portfolio statement. It can make lenders conserve cash. It can reduce new originations. It can make extensions harder, terms tighter, and refinancing scarcer. That means businesses already squeezed by floating rate debt, weaker margins, slower demand, and higher energy costs get hit by the one thing they cannot absorb, a credit door closing at the same moment their breathing gets harder. That is how a slowdown becomes a slump. Not because one asset manager misses a quarter, not because one borrower cheats, not because one insurer misjudges a feeder, because the people who replace the banks suddenly behave like scared gatekeepers instead of eager lenders. Credit is plumbing. Most people ignore it until the water stops. I have watched enough cycles to know that the public always notices the wrong thing first. They notice the loud event, the war, the election, the headline, the politician, the talking point. They do not notice the pipe pressure changing beneath the floorboards. Then one day a contractor, a restaurant owner, a regional supplier, a small manufacturer, a software company with too much floating debt, a sponsor-owned business that was fine at zero rates and sick at higher ones, discovers that refinancing is no longer a conversation. It is a verdict. That is when smoothness stops helping. You should also understand the social contrast here because it tells you who bears the hidden tax. At the top of the structure sit managers collecting fees on assets that do not need a daily referendum from the market. Around them sit advisors collecting commissions for moving clients into opacity. Around them sit institutions searching for yield while hoping the marks stay calm. At the far edge sits the ordinary saver being told this is access. He is not being invited to the feast. He is being invited to fund the room after the sophisticated money has already started walking toward the hallway. That is the retail trap in one sentence. When elite capital starts getting nervous about an opaque structure, the last person I want to see entering the structure is the ordinary retirement saver. Yet that is exactly when the language of democratization gets loudest. Whenever Wall Street uses the word democratization, you should put one hand on your wallet and the other on the doorknob. I am not telling you every private loan is fraud, every private credit fund is doomed, or every illiquid structure is irrational. That would be childish. The world is more nuanced than that. Some private credit managers are disciplined, some structures are honest about the lockup, some institutional capital can genuinely bear the illiquidity, some losses will remain contained, some funds will work through trouble and survive. But that is not the standard I use for my own capital. My standard is much harsher. If I need engineering, commissions, relabeling, suspended disbelief, and a prayer that everyone will stay calm around the gate, I am not interested. I do not need an asset to be fashionable. I need it to be legible. I need to know what I own, why I own it, what can go wrong, and whether the door belongs to me or to the manager. That is why I have always preferred simple things I can understand deeply. Great businesses with durable economics, broad public market exposure, when the terms are clear. Cash equivalents whose purpose is honesty, not illusion. Treasury obligations when I need certainty. Structures where volatility may annoy me, but opacity does not seduce me. There is a profound difference between discomfort and danger. Public markets often make you uncomfortable. Locked structures can make you helpless. Most amateurs choose helplessness because it feels calmer on the statement. That is backward. A temporary mark-to-market decline in something liquid may bruise your emotions, but it preserves your agency. You can think, you can compare, you can decide, you can refuse. That refusal power matters. I call it refusal capital. It is the right to say no tomorrow because you still control your money today. Illiquid complexity asks you to surrender refusal capital in exchange for a prettier month-to-month experience. That bargain is often terrible. Here is my door test, and I wish more people used it before signing papers. Ask yourself 4 questions. Who decides what this thing is worth when markets get ugly? Who gets paid before I get clarity? Who controls the gate if people want out? And if the explanation requires 10 minutes of vocabulary before it reaches plain English, why am I pretending I understand the risk better than the person selling it? Those questions eliminate a shocking amount of nonsense. You also need to become much more suspicious of incentives. If a product arrives in your retirement life with fanfare, high income language, low visible volatility, commission economics, and institutional branding, do not ask how premium it sounds. Ask why it needs to be pushed. Great opportunities in finance are usually bought because the buyer sees something others miss. Weak opportunities are sold because the seller sees something the buyer does not. That is a brutal distinction, but it will save you money. You cannot build freedom on top of borrowed confidence. And private credit, at least in the form described by this transcript, is drenched in borrowed confidence. Borrowed confidence from marks that do not clear in public every day. Borrowed confidence from wrappers that suggest more liquidity than the assets naturally have. Borrowed confidence from advisor incentives. Borrowed confidence from capital treatment tricks. Borrowed confidence from the belief that because the system is not 2008, it must be safe enough. Borrowed confidence from the hope that by the time the doors really matter, someone else will still be willing to wait. That is not how I think. I think from the door backward. If the borrower weakens, what happens? If growth slows, what happens if energy costs rise? What happens if floating rate debt bites harder? What happens if redemptions accelerate? What happens? If insurers pull back, what happens? If marks catch down to public reality, what happens if nobody is lying but everybody is merely optimistic? What happens? Once you think that way, a lot of the glamour disappears. Good glamour is expensive. The audience I care about is not the one chasing one more point of yield. It is the one that wants to stay in control of its life. If that is you, then you need to stop admiring products for how cleverly they smooth volatility and start judging them for how honestly they define ownership. Control is wealth. Clarity is wealth. The right to leave is wealth. A simple asset you understand is wealth. A transparent bruise is often safer than a hidden infection. Do not let anybody reverse that order in your mind. And let me tell you the part most people will resist. You may have to accept looking less sophisticated for a while. You may have to accept owning plainer things. You may have to accept hearing that you are missing elite access, alternative yield, institutional opportunities, or the future of portfolio construction. Fine. I have spent my whole life watching people confuse fashionable with intelligent. The market eventually humiliates that confusion. Your job is not to sound advanced at dinner. Your job is not to impress an advisor. Your job is not to collect exotic acronyms. Your job is to make sure your capital still answers to you when stress arrives. That is the whole test. Because when the door locks, all the language dies, the sales deck dies, the consultant language dies, the semi-liquid phrase dies, the private market access phrase dies, the confidence dies. The one thing left standing is structure. And structure tells the truth. So here is the choice I would leave you with. You can keep reaching for the smooth statement, the prettier yield, the flattering story that says you have finally graduated into the adult room of finance, even if the room only works when nobody heads for the exit. Or you can choose a colder, less glamorous path. You can demand transparency over theater. You can keep refusal capital. You can insist that a door must be a real door. You can accept visible volatility in exchange for legible ownership. You can stop paying an invisible tax for the privilege of being trapped politely. One of those paths will make you feel sophisticated. Now, the other one will keep you free later. I have learned that freedom is the higher return. So the next time somebody offers you extra yield wrapped in opacity, ask yourself one question and do not move until you can answer it in a single plain sentence. When the crowd turns, who owns the door? If the answer is not you, walk away before it locks.